Howdy, welcome to the Mays MasterCast. I'm your host, Ben Wiggins. It is a truly beautiful day in Aggie Land today, and we have a good friend of the show returning for today's discussion. Our former co-host, Dr. Shannon Deer, is joining us today with her co-author, Cheryl Miller, to talk a bit about their new book, Business Doing Good, Engaging Women and Elevating Communities. You, our listeners, are familiar with Shannon's work, both with the MasterCast and now as Associate Dean for undergraduate programs. As for Sheryl Miller, Cheryl owns Quantum Circles Consulting and Training. She provides training on topics that increase opportunities for transformation in three areas: economic development for the marginalized, effective communication focusing on the facilitation of conflict, and restorative justice. Cheryl has been a volunteer mediator for 16 years and has over 1,000 hours of experience of mediation with victims of violent crimes and their offenders. Cheryl was the executive director of a housing program in Victoria, Texas for 18 years. Looking forward to the discussion. Let's get into it. We welcome Shannon Deer and Cheryl Miller to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Ben Wiggins.
Hey, thanks.
Shannon, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Yes.
Cheryl, thank you as well. Cheryl, tell us a little bit about your story as a woman overcomer and how that's contributed to this process.
Well, it was about 30 years ago. I was single and pregnant and about to be homeless. Actually, I was homeless. But when I went into labor, found out I was having twins, surprise. And so I have two children that were born into the welfare system. And the people who worked with me at that time really understood the principles that we write about in this book, that even though it hadn't been written yet. And so my journey of transitioning out of poverty and into a career is really what inspired the work that I did for 18 years at a housing program in my community, and then, of course, led to writing this book.
Okay. The book is based on 6 women's stories. Which was the most impactful for each of you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And to be clear on the stories, they're a compilation of hundreds of women's stories that we put into 6 ultimately fictional stories, but each piece of the story is true and based on true stories. So one of the stories that was most impactful for me was one of the women stories who I interviewed in doing the research. And she talked about how when she was living on the streets and doing drugs and working in the sex trade, she would hide from the school bus in the mornings, because she would be ending her day when elementary school students were starting their day, but she didn't want them to see her in the way that she was in the morning. And so she would jump behind a bush or a shrub and hide. And towards the end of her story, or not the end of her story, but towards the victory of her story, she had then elementary school children that she would proudly put on that same bus once she went through recovery and went through the program that Cheryl ran. And to me, that was such just a visual of what it was like for her to feel shame and to hide from the world and to not want those elementary school students to see her, and then to have children that she was proud to be putting on those same school buses that she was hiding from. It just was such a powerful illustration for me of what transformation can really look like.
Beautiful.
Well, I think it's hard to say because there's pieces of so many different women in each story.
Right.
And so, but probably one of the ones that really inspired me a lot was a young woman who dropped out of school when she was in 8th grade. She started using drugs when she was 11. She went through all kinds of abuse during her childhood. But when she came through our program, I think she started smoking crack at around 15, because that's what her family did. In fact, she said, I was born into poverty. My mom was born into poverty. My grandmother was born into poverty. It's just the way life was. There was no getting over it. There was no getting out of it. And then she ended up going through our housing program. And over a course of about 3 or 4 years, going through some tumultuous times, she ended up going back and getting her GED. That was probably her biggest challenge, was, making that first step to say, I'm going to try to do this. She got her GED. She went on to attend college, and now she's a teacher. She's a preschool teacher. And, she and her husband are doing great. And so she's just such an amazing success story.
And each story is associated with a principle then. And of these principles that are outlined in the book, which one sings the most to you, Cheryl? Let's start with you.
Well, for me, I would say probably the restorative justice, because it's such a big part of what I've done for the last 18 years, because I've worked in the field of restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
And when we took the principles out of the context of the criminal justice system and implemented them into our programming, the concepts, it really dramatically changed the impact that we were having. And so for me, it's probably one of the most significant principles because of the fact it has the potential to change things so much more rapidly than what normally occurs.
Can you explain restorative justice? Because no one in the business world, well, few people in the business world really know what restorative justice is.
Well, restorative justice actually comes out of the criminal justice system, and it's just a different way of looking at crime. Instead of saying what law was broken and what's the penalty for breaking that law, restorative justice says who's been harmed and what needs to be done to repair that harm. So we took that same kind of approach, working with the women that I worked with. Who has been harmed? Who's responsible for repairing this harm? And then how do we go about doing that to bring about healing for everybody that's been impacted?
Yeah. And in the chapter, we probably wrote that chapter 50 times and rewrote that chapter and then rewrote it another 50 times because it was really hard to try to break down restorative justice in a business context in however many pages that chapter is, but to put that in a book and really represent that in a business context, because a lot of companies have now taken those restorative justice concepts from the criminal justice system and applied them into a business setting and in using it in harm reduction, conflict management, but even in team building and in strategic planning, and using those concepts to make sure that everyone in the organization has a voice. And it really does a lot for creating a much more inclusive environment where everyone is heard, which is really important when you're working with women who have historically been marginalized in their past. So it is a really important principle. I don't know if it was my favorite because it still gives me a headache sometimes. No, I love the way it ended up in the book, but it was hard.
Then how would you implement this into a team building setting? Like what has to change from moving it from the justice system to a business setting?
Well, I think you need to understand the principles that make restorative justice work. There's several things: creating a safe place, making sure everybody has a direct voice, identifying all the stakeholders that are involved in whatever the issue you're talking about, and where's the accountability if there is harm. And so you would first have to understand those pieces, and then you would just look at the context that you're working in and say, okay, where do we adjust to make sure we have these pieces in place? And then you can even use processes like circles as a way to facilitate dialogue, both to address conflict and to do strategic planning and team building. It's a facilitated dialogue that's highly effective.
And so it works in the criminal justice setting in making sure that you might have, and I'm going to give my translation of restorative justice and then let Cheryl correct it, but you might have a circle of people and each person gets a chance to talk, and there's a process for making that happen. And each person gets a chance to talk about each topic that's brought up. But in the criminal justice setting, you might have the family of a victim or a victim also have the perpetrator there. You might have the police officer who was involved in the arrest there, community members that have been affected by the crime. So that's what it would be in the context of a criminal justice system where you have this circle and this really powerful way of everyone getting to say what they need to say to feel heard in that setting. But it works perfectly in a strategic planning setting, you can see, or a team building setting, or managing conflict within an office. You can see how it would work there, where everyone gets a chance to be heard. And there's a mediator, someone like Cheryl, who comes in and can make sure that everyone is being heard and following the kind of rules or norms that were set up at the beginning of that process.
Yeah, and that's what we've done in the past, or at least what I've done a little bit, is do training around that. And I've trained several large organizations, particularly their HR department and some of the attorneys, looking at how are we going to address some of the conflicts. And they're using circles as a way to do that.
Is there a point in the justice system at which this concept breaks down? Like, how would you, I'm trying to figure out what could break this system. Like how would you handle this with a serial killer?
Well, it would be very challenging, for one thing, because there would be multiple victims involved. But where it will break down immediately is if there's harm that's been done and the person that that created that harm or did the harm doesn't take responsibility. So the process completely stops because there has to be full accountability for the harm that's done. And so that's one of the places where the process can stop.
But in the criminal justice system, it is used for murder cases.
Yes.
And it is sometimes even, again, I've learned a lot about this, so I'm not the expert Cheryl is, but sometimes used for sentencing as well.
Oh.
So
yeah, for the reason why I knew about restorative justice is because for 18 years, actually now it's been 20 years. For 20 years, I'm getting old. For 20 years, I've been a volunteer for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice through their victim offender mediation dialogue program. And so I actually do mediations between victims of severe violent crime and their offenders in prison. And so most of the cases that I mediate are murders and, DWI, manslaughter, sexual assault, that kind of thing. So that's the reason, that's my background. That's why I knew it worked, because I saw the impact it was having in that system. And then we implemented those same principles, just the concepts, not necessarily the programming, into our housing program. And we saw dramatic transformation as well. So that's why I know that the concepts can be taken out of the justice system and implemented into a nonprofit organization, into a business setting, and they'll have a significant impact.
And one of the things that you talk about in the book is the importance of a 3-point partnership between the women, nonprofits, and then businesses as well. Why is that so important?
Yeah. So one, the part of the point in that partnership is the women themselves and making sure that women have autonomy, which is one of the things that restorative justice actually does. It gives everyone in the organization direct voice. So having the women be part of their future and planning their future, there's a lot of organizations that in the past have not given women autonomy in how they manage their recovery from addiction or their process out of the sex trade. And so making women the top of that triangle is really important. Mm-hmm. But there's also a really amazing opportunity for nonprofit organizations and businesses to partner with each other in that 3-point partnership. And there's lots of ways they can do that. But one is for nonprofit organizations to be a hiring pipeline for businesses. So we don't necessarily recommend, we want companies to hire women who have overcome challenging passive incarceration, addiction, poverty, and engagement in the sex trade. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily recommend walking up to prison and watching women walk out and saying, do you want a job? That's not necessarily what we're recommending. Some organizations will do that. They will hire women straight out of prison. We think it works better when there's that connection with a nonprofit organization that's supporting the women who are overcoming those challenging pasts, because a nonprofit organization is providing wraparound services for the women. They can provide childcare and transportation, things that you wouldn't expect a company to provide. And they also know which women going through their organization are ready for the types of jobs that these companies are going to have. And so they really can work as almost a hiring agency to say, hey, who do you have that's ready to work for our company? And so that pipeline is really important.
And the other piece of that is that I think is important to mention. We were doing really good work in our nonprofit organization, helping women transform their lives, but we kept running into the barrier of not having good jobs, not being able to be employed at a level that allowed them to maintain a healthy financial lifestyle. And so having that connection to businesses that were willing to hire was invaluable as a nonprofit, because it's like you're going to hit that glass wall eventually. Anybody who's working with women in transition or anybody in poverty is going to come up against that barrier of gainful employment. And so to me, businesses are the answer to that. They have the golden ticket. They have the last piece of the puzzle, which is the employment that these women, and I believe it works for men as well, that they need to make that final step into a transition into a stable future.
And we talk a lot about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and what we're trying to accomplish in the context of business. There's a lot of conversation around corporate social responsibility or environmental, social, and governance and ESG, CSR. Those are really hot topics right now in a business setting. Mm-hmm. And this is an area where companies can really engage in ESG or CSR or sustainability, whatever you want to call it, in a way that benefits them too, in a way that aligns with that company's strategic mission of hiring top talent. Because we believe that Of course, this 3-point partnership or hiring women who have overcome challenging past benefits the women and their children for generations to come. As you hear with Cheryl's story, having her now children have children who were not born in poverty because of the principles applied to Cheryl's life and what she overcame. So that can benefit generations to come. But it also benefits companies because they're hiring top talent who have unique skills that I frankly don't have. I have not overcome in the way that these women have. I don't have the same type of resilience and tenacity and ability to hustle and motivate that the women that I met in my research and that Cheryl served in the nonprofit organization have. And that's really powerful for these companies that are looking for people who have diverse perspectives and diverse experiences to bring in and help them transform their organizations as well.
Yeah, and even though the businesses have the ticket for the women to have a job, the reality is though, they've probably hired some of these women before and maybe not has had the success that they need. And that's where the nonprofit comes in because the nonprofit really understands the clients. I mean, I knew the women that I worked with. So the businesses that I worked with where we did hiring, where they were hiring our women, we would have conversations about, the context and the environments that they need to create where these women could thrive. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what the book is about, is helping businesses create an environment and a context when they bring these women in. They tap into the potential and really set them up for great success, which in the end, like she said, benefits the bottom line for the business.
What's the pushback that you get from businesses most often? What's the biggest point of skepticism?
We haven't been getting much lately, actually, which is pretty magical. So we've talked to some large corporations who have all committed really to hire overcomers, especially people who have had a background of incarceration. There's the Second Chance Business Coalition that has brought together the largest companies in the country to commit to hiring people who have had a felony background. And they're doing things that will, in two places, one in the hiring process that moves the question about criminal records to later in the hiring process, moves background checks to later in the hiring process, which gives someone more of a chance to make an impression on the organization in the hiring process. And then also putting things in place, piloting programs they can put in place within the company to make the environment conducive to people who have had a background of incarceration. And so companies are excited, especially at kind of the higher levels, the officer levels, the executive levels, even in the legal departments, they're working on ways to make sure they can put this in place. We're trying to push it down to more of the manager level where some of those biases do come in play, where a manager might say, oh, I don't know if I want to hire someone into this job with
because there's more direct interaction there and more direct responsibility and
just a lack of awareness, maybe an understanding about what bringing someone in with a criminal record really means.
And I think the other reason we're not getting as much resistance right now is because of the great demand for employees. I mean, companies are having to be creative. They're having to look at how am I going to bring in, engage new employees and bring people into work. And so, they're already trying to think creatively anyway. So the idea of having some kind of collaborative work is very appealing. So
what can we as a society and we as individuals do to help overcomers? Women overcomers,
Well, my first thought would be first see the potential in them, see that they have something very significant to give. Don't look at what's wrong and what's missing and what they need and how they're broken. Look at what do they have to offer? What's the potential? What are the great assets that they can bring? And then walk alongside them to bring those out and to plug those into the context where it's going to be most beneficial for them.
Yeah, I love that one too. That's really fits with one of the principles in the book, translation factor, of helping women identify what are the strengths and skills that they have that they even gained in a context that is not valued in society. So they gained in the drug trade, in the sex trade, in poverty. Those are contexts that typically society has marginalized. And yet they gained a lot of really valuable skills in those environments that people like Cheryl, when they come into their lives and say, hey, I see that skill in you. I know where you've used it before, but let's translate that into business and see how valuable it can be. That if someone can step into their lives and say that, it is incredibly transformational. And saw it over and over again in the research that I did, where that translation factor was so important for them. But I agree, walking alongside them as business professionals, we can do some pretty easy things like mentoring women who are starting businesses. Cheryl had a lot of success with microlending and helping women start businesses that were exiting through her organization.
Mhm.
So contributing to a microlending program, mentoring someone who is starting a business doesn't take a ton of time. There's programs like the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. There's many different programs that can help with that, and organizations as well that are investing in women in that way. And then hire women overcomers.
Yeah, I think, in the years in those early years in the transition, there was two mindsets that I came across. One of them were the ones that said, no, you need to go back to school. You've got something to give. You need to make a future for your children. And the other ones looked at me with pity. And the ones that pushed me, even though it was irritating at times, it made me feel good. It made me feel like they saw value in me. They saw something in me that was worthy. And the ones who looked at me like they felt sorry for me or with pity, it just kind of heaped more shame. And it was not a pleasant feeling at all. So needless to say, I gravitated to the ones that were pushing me and recognizing that I had something to offer.
Where do we draw the line then between pity and something more constructive like sympathy or empathy? Is it all just in the details?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I do think it has to do with the way we view people. If we view people, and especially if they're in a challenging situation, if we look at only what's broken and the needs that they have, we're getting too close to that pity line. We have to be able to also see, okay, this doesn't have to be permanent. And what gifts does this individual have that I can see and I can start, pushing them towards and challenging them to go towards that. And so I think it's in that the way we view people that really is the fine line.
We talk a lot in the book about asset-based versus needs-based. And it really is what Cheryl's talking about there, that if you approach someone as if they have assets, so an asset-based approach, that they have assets to bring, they have skills and strengths to bring, that's much more powerful than if you just look at the needs that need to be met. And it comes across in the way that organizations support women. So even, let's say a woman needs transportation. One organization might just gift her a car. Another organization might work with her to save money over time to buy a car at a very discounted price. Slightly different approaches, but one might look a little bit more like pity and not have the same self-responsibility as the other, where you're asking her to save some money, hit some milestones, and then buy a car. Again, it might be at a very discounted rate, but buy a car and have ownership of that car, feel like she was part of that process. That's more asset-based than needs-based.
So it's a more built-out version of give a person a fish versus teach a person to fish.
Or better yet, start microlending and let them buy the pond.
I love that. I love that. Shannon, Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time.
Glad
Looking
to be
forward to
here.
reading the book.
Thanks.
I love being back on MasterCast.
Yes. Good to have you. Thank you for listening to our discussion. For our first takeaway, I'd like to spend a little more time exploring the concept of restorative justice, because that's something that was kind of a theme permeating today's conversation. Restorative justice is an approach to justice in which one of the responses to a crime is to organize a meeting between the victim and the offender, sometimes with representatives of the wider community. The goal is for them to share their experience of what happened, to discuss who was harmed by the crime and how, and to create a consensus for what the offender can do to repair the harm from the offense. This may include a payment of money given from the offender to the victim, apologies and other amends, and other actions to compensate those affected and to prevent the offender from causing future harm. I love the idea of this because it humanizes everyone. One of the things that seems to most consistently lead to destructive behavior is dehumanization. This is the opposite of that, and I love this approach to both the legal system and business, if we're being honest. It seems like a great way to conduct business because humanization is never going to lead to bad things. For our second takeaway, let's talk about nonprofits as a midpoint for business hiring in terms of people with background challenges. I thought this was a great system too in terms of accountability, training, and confidence building. And I'm wondering how we can build on the structure that Shannon and Cheryl discussed in terms of the relationship between businesses as a whole and nonprofits as a whole. A lot of good food for thought there. Finally, for our third takeaway, I'd like to revisit what they said about empowering women overcomers. The whole idea of looking to empower people who have not had the same opportunities as I myself or we ourselves have had is really about considering what they bring to the table and being aware that there may be shortfalls in education or experience and making an allowance for those shortfalls without being condescending, seeing the human and believing what they can become. That's really what it's about. And now I will close this with a quote from Naval Ravikant. The ideal school would teach health, wealth, and happiness. It'd be free, self-paced, and available to all. It'd show opposing ideas, and students would self-verify truth. No grades, no tests, no diplomas, just learning. Actually, you're already here. Careful who you follow. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support. Drop us a like below and feel free to leave a comment if you wish. We appreciate positivity and constructive feedback. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on our latest episodes and bonus content. You can also take us on the road using your favorite podcast listening app. We have those linked below. If you'd like to know more about Mays Business School or our guests, visit mays.tamu.edu/podcasts. Talk with you soon.